I want to thank all of you. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. I love being in your beautiful country, and I'm having a great time. Good food, too much food. I'm delighted today to talk about building blocks for school success, children's early learning environment. And I think it's appropriate that I followed these two wonderful speakers who spoke a lot about the brain and development, and both talked about the importance of the home environment. And so I'm going to take us to behavior now and to ask, what are the features of the home environment that support learning? So I'm going to start off with some core principles, and then I'm going to talk about some research findings, and hopefully we'll have a little time for one or two questions. So the core principles that underlie my work are, first, that the building blocks for development are established in infancy and early childhood. We heard the term sensitive period. I think of these first years of life as an important sensitive period in development, as do many developmental scientists. Second, parenting and early environments are vital. So parents are the ones who are organizing those environments, and these early skills can snowball or cascade over time. So the first principle, building blocks, we know the first years of life are a time of rapid brain development, language and communication skills. Children are learning to regulate their emotions. They're learning about emotions. They're forming attachments and social relationships. And broadly, they're growing their knowledge about the world. And all of this is feeding into the development of the brain, as we've seen. Parents, however, are vital in that they are the ones who directly interact with children, talk to them. They are the ones who structure activities of the day, and they also determine what materials will be available to children for play. The third idea I'd like to put forth is that skills build on skills. They will affect other skills. And these are the constructs or notions of developmental cascades and snowball effects. So tiny differences, like a snowball, at the start of development can spiral and grow, whether that's for better or for worse. And we see from the work of Hart and Risley and many others that, in fact, early differences, these very small differences, grow over time. You're looking on the left at a graph of children's words, how many words they have in their vocabulary. Children from low socioeconomic status households, middle, and high SES households. So over time, you could see these curves are diverging, and children are showing twice as many or more words from upper income families than from lower income families. And those differences do not diminish. They continue over time. So when people say children will catch up, that's a misnomer. And it's really tough to change those disparities as children get older. And so the focus of my work at NYU has, number one, we start in infancy, often at the birth of children. Second, we focus on parenting and multiple aspects of parenting to determine what matters in the home environment. And third, we look at cascading influences by following children longitudinally over time. So I want to talk first about what I mean by the home learning environment. We think of the home learning environment as composed of three key components that we assess at every year in development. The first is learning activities, and that has to do with how parents structure the environment. I'll talk about that in a moment. Second is the quality of the mother-child reciprocal relationship. And the third are the materials, the spaces and places and things that children have available for exploration and discovery. So learning activities is how a day is structured. How does a parent lay out the opportunities for a child over the course of the time from when child wakes up to goes to sleep? We figure that out through interviews with mothers, typically with moms, through time diaries. We document from morning until night what a child is doing, and from just observations in the home of everyday routines. The second thing we focus on is the quality of interactions, and we focus primarily on language inputs, that's diverse. Diverse in the number of words parents are providing children, how many different words, and so forth. We also look at the temporal aspects of language input. The responsiveness, is it contingently tied within 2 seconds to what a baby or a child is doing? And we do that from coding video records of parent-child interactions. And finally, we look at learning materials by looking at what access to books and puzzles and toys and blocks and space and what children have available for learning. And we do that by observing the home environment once more, doing things like counting the books children have and so forth, and also interviews with parents. So what I'm going to do is take those 3 components of the environment, activity structure, quality, materials, and I'm going to illustrate with book reading how those are important. So we ask for activities. How often do parents incorporate book reading into their interactions with children over the course of a day? How do mothers interact around book sharing? And which kind of books are available? And the reason we're interested in book reading is because Dr. Seuss told us that you're never too old, too wacky, too wild to pick up a book and read to a child. And you will see this is absolutely true in how early this matters. So really, why book reading? First of all, books provide opportunity to be exposed to words a child might not otherwise hear in their daily life. So you're reading a book about animals at the zoo. And unless you go to the zoo and see those animals, child's not going to have opportunity to learn those words. Second, book reading helps early on with emergent literacy skills, understanding that characters and print map to words and words combine into sentences and so forth. And then finally, book sharing actually bolsters cognitive skills. Children hear narratives, they can create narratives, it aids problem solving, drawing inferences, imagination, and creativity. So let me show you and convince you with some of the research findings from our lab. So I'm going to start with everyday activities, how often parents are structuring the day to incorporate book reading. And we were looking at, this time we're only looking at frequency. Is book reading part of everyday activities? We saw 2,500 children and moms throughout the United States. They're all, I'll be talking predominantly, all of these families are low income, ethnically diverse, and we visited that at 1, 2, and 3 years of age in their homes. And mothers reported on how often they read books with their children at each point and how much that was a part of their day. And then we assessed children on standard tests like receptive language, using the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, cognition, using the Bailey Mental Development Instrument, and so forth. And what we find when we do this is that book reading at 1 year of age and 2 years of age, what that was doing is associated with larger vocabulary in children, and this led to then the vocabulary helped with standardized assessments, cognitive assessments. So this is kind of the path we find. You could see that looking at this in these 2,000 kids or so, that parents who start reading early, their stability over age, they're reading more and more over time, and that at every age, reading maps to vocabulary, which then helps children in their cognitive skills at 3 years of age. We're going to go a little beyond 3 in a minute. But some of the limitations here is, well, that's sort of interesting, but it's only one tiny piece of the puzzle. We know how much quantity doesn't mean quality, right? So we don't know how parents are interacting with their children. So what we define as high quality interactions are those in which you see, particularly in early infancy, in 1 and 2 years, contingent responding to child interests. So if a child's looking at, touching, pointing, vocalizing, that a parent responds in that. Dialogic reading is providing information to a child, but also encouraging the child to participate through the use of questions. And then finally, developmental attunement. We're doing longitudinal work, so we need to know how these things change over development in line with the growing skills of a child. So what I'd like to do now is show you 2 video clips so you could see what we mean by contingent responsiveness and reciprocal interactions, what we consider to be quality interactions.
Apple. Look, a little apple. A medium apple.
Can you hear it?
A big apple. Cookies.
What's that?
Those are apples.
What's that?
That's an apple.
What's that?
That's an apple.
What's that?
A ball. What's this?
What's that?
What's that? Birthday cake? Mmm.
Big.
Who birthday?
Me.
Yours?
Okay, so you can see this kind of back and forth reciprocity, which is really temporally aligned between mother and child. Here's another example, hopefully.
7.
Summer.
Basketballs.
Basketball.
Ooh, cookies.
Oh, cookies.
What's that?
Apple.
Those are apples?
Apple. Apple.
Yeah, let's see what's this.
Apple.
The little ball.
Cake.
What's that?
Cake.
Yeah, cake.
What's that? What's that?
That's a cake.
What's that?
And a candle.
What's that?
And another cake.
Apple. Apple. Apple.
Yeah, the balls.
So you see how everything mother says is attuned to where the child's looking and touching and so forth. But over time, things have to change. You don't just keep saying, what's that, what's that, what's that? So as time goes on, parents and children develop skills. Parents will increasingly encourage more sophisticated contributions on the part of their children, and I'll show you this a little bit later. And they do this often through asking questions. So we were curious about the role questions play in book reading. Are those kind of questions you saw? What's that? And asking what's going to happen. How does that matter? And we did this now. We saw these children a little bit older. We saw mothers and their 4-year-olds sharing a wordless book. And a year later, we asked children to tell a story themselves with a wordless book. We were curious how this reciprocity helped children create and imagine stories on their own. And then we tested the role of questions. So we gave moms and children the book. It's a wordless book. Please share this book with your child. Frog, where are you? And this book is divided into a main event, which is this frog leaves a jar in the boy's room and disappears. And then there's plans of action or attempt to find the frog. And so you get every mom gets the same pictures, but we saw very different types of stories, very different interactions. So again, we were interested in statements and questions. Statements would be things like, the boy's looking for the frog. The frog got out of the jar. That would be the mother providing. Questions would be, what is the boy looking for, etc. And then after that, a year later, we brought children back and we said to them, can you tell me a story with this book? And it was called Hug. It's a wordless book, and it shows a little monkey going through the forest, seeing all these other animals hugging their mommy or daddy, and the frog looks very sad, and he's kind of going page through the forest, and at the end, there's mommy or daddy, and there's a big hug, and everyone is happy. But remember, there's no words there, and kids can't read. So they had to just, through looking at the pictures, be able to tell a story, and we looked at how sophisticated their stories were with respect to the quality of their interaction with parents. So what we found overall, and this is actually something we see a lot in the low-income families we study, is that mothers rarely are asking questions. They're largely narrating and having children listen. But there was variability around the questions, and what's notable, the only thing that explains children's contributions to being able to tell a story were questions. So just narrating to a child without the give and take is not supporting outcomes and development. And what happens over time, therefore, is as parents encourage children through joint engagement, through questions, children learn how to contribute with the parent and then independently carry those skills over to their own abilities to narrate and tell stories. But it's not that simple. So not all questions are created equal, okay? So different questions might elicit different levels of child contribution. And this comes from the notion of cognitive distancing, okay? So if I ask you something basic, like what's that? It's very concrete. But if I ask you to, what do you think will happen next? You have to actually reason and problem solve. So we looked at different types of questions in 235 mothers and their 4-year-olds with this book, Frog, Where Are You? And we coded questions and children's contributions at 3 levels of cognitive sophistication. And then we also looked at how the reciprocity, the sequencing, temporal alignment was from mother to child, and using sequential analysis, which is a statistical approach. Again, Frog, where are you? And let me give you an idea of what the questions, so referential questions, and remember you just saw a 1-year-old. What's that? What's that? A 2-year-old? What's that? What's that? What's that? That's a referential question. What color is that? What is that? But behavioral questions go beyond that to think of action, which is more sophisticated. What is the boy doing? And then finally, inferential questions makes the child think and problem solve. How does the boy feel? What's going to happen next, okay? So we looked at these different forms of questions in mothers and the kind of contributions children were capable of making to the story. For sequential analysis, we use this statistical approach to look at the conditional probability that a child's response follows mother and mother's response follows child, right? You're looking at that reciprocity I just showed you. And so this would be something in sequential analysis that would get you high scores in that you have mother asks a question, child responds. Mother asks a question, child responds. Okay? And this would be something different if you had mother asks question, 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 then child says 3 things. Notably, when you use regular statistics, you have 3 and 3 in both those cases, right? 3 mom questions, 3 child responses, but the 2 of them are very different. One is reciprocal and temporally connected, and the other are responses that are not temporally connected. We test this alignment with adjusted z-scores and what's called Yule's Q. And we find that we could look at then how questions feed into the child and child feeds into mom and so forth. And we wondered, do questions matter in specific ways? Yes, they do, as you might expect. The Yule's Q, they're almost perfect in that 1.0 is a perfect correspondence. So when mothers are asking those kind of what's that basic referential questions, that's the level children remain. It's blue, it's a jar, it's a frog. When they are asking behavioral questions, children are operating behaviorally, and inferential questions are getting children to reason and problem solve at a higher level. I'm going to show you how parents, and I should just mention the negative, I think is also interesting, that when mothers are keeping to the low level, children are not drawing any inferences. They're not going beyond the concrete picture in front of them. So we do find there's bidirectional processes going on in this pattern of specific questions. So this is a low level. I just want to give you a sense of what it sounds like. Where's the frog at? That's a referential question. Okay, so I have little notes on what our codes were. In here. What is that? A frog container. Yeah, but the frog was on what? Container. And what is this? A dog. And what is this? A boy. That's a 4-year-old, right? And now I'll show you something a little different, another dyad. He's going to catch the doggy. What's the doggy doing? That's a behavioral question. He's always running. Why? That's an inferential question. Because he's already scared of the bugs. Look, what's going on here? That's, again, a behavioral question. He looked out at the bird. Why? So you could see this mother's always why, right? So the child is continually being scaffolded to reason about the story. So the take-home message so far is that different types of questions provide different opportunities for learning. Referential questions perhaps are supporting vocabulary, and they matter with young little kids, right? But as you get older, behavioral and inferential questions are helping children draw information beyond the immediate context. And this kind of idea of reciprocity is what we call a kind of conversational duet. So let me turn to materials. Do the types of books matters? So what we did is we started to think, there are very many different types of books out there. A book about the ABCs may teach the alphabet, but it's very limited in the richness of a storyline and richness of vocabulary. And books with storylines, in contrast, support narrative skills, inferences, okay? Pre-academic skills might not be really like knowing your numbers, knowing your letters. And parents believe those to be so important, right? But they don't realize the importance of narrative stories. So we had 153 mothers of 4-year-olds, and we asked them, what type of books do you have at home? And then we classified books into 2 categories: all their pre-academic books, which teach concepts, and narrative books, which tell a story. So we would say things like, does your child have books about shapes, opposite content, letters, numbers, colors? Or relationships, humors, storylines, daily activities, cultural traditions. Which ones do you think, by the way, they have? The top row dominates, right? Dominates. Parents think that's what matters, right? But actually, they don't help much. So children who had access to these basic concept books about numbers and letters, their mothers were asking very low-level questions when we actually look at them interacting. So it's like having those books kind of leads to a close-ended thinking. What number is that? What letter is that? And it does not help children. So the children who had those books at home were not the ones who could create stories and reason and problem solve. But children with access to narrative books, folk tales, stories at home, we just independently assessed what they had at home and then how they talked about things. They were able to contribute to narratives at high levels and draw inferences. So narrative books lead to questions, and questions lead to contributions, and there are indirect effects. I'm not going to... It's basically repeating what I just said in my model. So the take-home message is that pre-academic books really promote kind of close-ended thinking, right? Convergent thinking. And for divergent thinking, you need the narrative and storytelling type of skills, and you need a different kind of question to the child. So books with stories are promoting richer interactions in these older children. So now for a minute, I want to put some of this together and move just beyond books in the closing section. I want to talk about how the broader home environment, including book reading, but also expanding to other learning activities like puzzles and going to the library and so forth, support children's skills over developmental time. So again, we're going to look at those 2,500 children. We followed them from 1 year to pre-K, saw them every single year in their homes, looked at interactions. We looked at their learning activities, how days were structured, the quality of interactions, what materials they had for learning at home, and notably, keep an eye on developmental attunement. So when I say close-ended questions, what's that? Aren't good. They're not good for 4-year-olds, but with 1-year-olds, they are quite good. So we looked at how parents were scaffolding development in line with children's growing skills. Because it's really tough being a parent. You actually have to, your kid's changing every day. So modifying learning environment and input to match child skill is an important aspect of developmental scaffolding. Okay, you need to have interactions that grow in complexity from low-level questions to higher. You need materials that grow with children's skill, and the day needs to be structured in different ways that move beyond even book reading to things like going to the library, for example. So what I'm going to show you is a video clip just to see what our longitudinal work looks like. It will be an African-American little girl and her mother. You're going to see them sharing a wordless book when she was 14 months, 24 months, 36 months, all the way through 5 years of age. And you're going to see the child then reading the hug book. We said, here you go, read us, tell us this story. Not read, tell us the story. I'd like you to watch how the mother changes from simple labeling to more advanced words, to very simple questions, to inferential-based questions that stimulate thinking and problem solving, and then you'll see how the child creates her story.
Ball. You see the ball? Look. 1, 2 balls, 3. Look. You want to flip the page? Okay. Cookie. 3, yeah. Earring. Oh, look at the baby. Pretty eyes, right? Where's his tongue? How is his face expression? He looks what? Is he sad? Is he mad? Does he look mad or sad? Look at the picture. No, what's that? He looks mad or sad?
Oh. Well, luckily we have... Okay, so what is he looking for? So she's asking her to solve. So from looking out the window, right? Do you think it's night or do you think it's day? It's night. You think it's night. Is the light on in his bedroom or is it off? So she's asking, this kind of creating. Oh, I wish we could get the sound for this one. Once upon a time, he was pointing to the elephant. And he was walking. And the elephant was there and he was sad. He wanted to look for his mommy, but he can't find his mommy. And so she goes on and on to tell this whole story just by looking at the pictures. It would have been nicer if you could have heard the child and not me. Okay, so what we did is we took the 2,500 children and we took at every age, we looked at these three aspects of the home environment and looked at what their change trajectories looked like. And we identified the first group we called the low-rise group. These are children whose environments remained very low, right? You see over time, and they gradually grew, but they remained quite low. And then there was another group that started low and got even worse over time. That's a low decline group. We had a group called moderate decline. They were somewhere in the middle, their environments, but declined over age. And then there's another group that did pretty well. They're in the middle, and they're getting gradually better. And then there was another group that started high. We call these high declines, but declined over age. And we could talk later about why this is going on in the declines. And then finally, a high stable group where their environments were good stably across the first years of life. There were several hundred kids in each of these cells, so because we had 2,500 kids. So, all right, and what we did then is we looked at school readiness outcomes, all right? And this is just one outcome. We did it on several others. This is vocabulary, receptive language. And what you could see is these are the 6 groups I just showed you, those 6 trajectories. Children in the low-rise group, their PPVT scores, which is like a standardized assessment, so 100 is the national norm in the United States, their norms were at 80. And that's with and without covariates, the 2 models. And then if you look at the high group, way at the one who stayed stable, their average IQs were, PPVT scores, were close to 105, which is actually higher than national norms. And these are all poor kids from poor families. And just to show you kids who are at risk, we found that the low rise, we looked at what percentage of children fell below 85, which is the score needed for early intervention or intervention in schools. And we found that 71% of children with those low environments early on were at risk. And in the high stable group, only 8% were at risk. And this was found for PPVT, letter word identification, which is kind of emergent literacy skills, and then applied problems were math skills. Same exact findings for all of these. We then followed these families up when children were in 5th grade. So now the kids are 11 years of age, and we went into the home and counted how many books there were, and we actually were shocked at these differences in the stability in that environment. So children who had the low quality scores in those first few years of life, in 5th grade, the low decline group, had about 12 children's books. And children who had those early high stable environments had 110 books. So really thinking about how stable these environments are and how these habits solidify. And these were reflected in their PPVT scores, in their reading scores, and their math scores. I'll show you very quickly. This kind of captures it all. We took all the outcomes for children, and we classified them as whether all their scores consistently fell above the mean, they were doing better than everyone else in the cohort, or below the mean, doing worse. Academic success were kids who were doing well in reading, doing well in math, doing well in vocabulary, and so forth. And you could see in the low decline group, 83% were at academic risk, meaning all their scores were low, all of them. And those in the high stable group, 55% of those children were doing better than national norms. They were better on all of those scores across the board. We would have liked that to be higher, but I want you to remember these are all children from low-income, ethnically diverse families in the U.S. So importantly, there's cascades going on. We've replicated models separately for everything I've shown you in African American, white, and Latino samples. And what we find is cascades, early environments in those first years of life are helping children with foundational school readiness skills, and those then snowball over time to explain later fifth grade academics. And by the way, the environment continues to exert an influence in fifth grade, as I just showed you. So I'd like to summarize messages for educators and parents. Start early. These early learning environments matter at 1 year of age, obviously even before that, as we've shown in other work, and they have cascading effects over time. Second, the quality of interactions, asking questions, engaging children in book reading and other activities. It could be play, it could be just eating dinner at night. That matters for children in a reciprocal, contingent, temporally aligned way. Questions matter, but input needs to be tailored to the developmental level of a child. So basic questions for a 1-year-old, but inferential questions for a 4-year-old. And then finally, access to books. When we think about creating a rich, literate, rich environment, a variety of book types matter, especially narrative books, and parents have no idea about that, by the way. Those are the ones that support storytelling and imagination in children. And so I'd like to thank our funders and our families and you for listening to me.
好多謝教授。咁嗱就大家有問題咧嚇，請舉手啊！我哋咧就盡量爭取時間，可以回答多啲問題。係又先生啦，咁啊先生帶頭問問題。
Excuse me, I'm the first one always ask silly questions. So this is quite contrary to most of the Chinese belief thing, because Chinese believe very much in memorizing. And this is point number one. And this too, of course, I got many questions over my head. I want to make time for the others too. About the screen time, the people spend lots of time over the screen. And the third thing is, there's a sort of survey saying that the reading habits of most of the people in Asia actually dropped tremendously. Books are not selling, because the people don't really carry on reading books. Yeah. So overall, I think, I'm very proud to say, we Chinese still working quite okay in that sense. I mean, they're good in mathematics, they're good in general science and everything. How would this explain this sort of big divergence between the West and the East and the way they work, but the end result?
So I have a few answers. Number one, I don't want to come across saying that ABCs, 1, 2, 3s, etc. don't matter. I mean, absolutely, children learning shapes, playing with puzzles, counting, cardinality, 1, 2, 3. All of those are absolutely bolstering math scores. Playing with puzzles is bolstering spatial cognition, which leads to math and so forth. But I think what happens is that's building a knowledge base, right? It's building knowledge and certain types of skills. But we want children to also be able to tell stories, problem solve, create narratives, imagination, creative, and so forth. So I think the message is that you want a variety of books. You want to build those concepts. You want to certainly build them. But parents are ignoring this. Parents, even in the, you go to a bookstore, there's all those kind of close-ended books, and parents don't realize that this storytelling, oral storytelling matters a lot, using these and telling stories. The second thing on screen time is a major problem. Number one, a lot of families think little babies will learn from watching screens. They put screens on. Educational apps sell like crazy, and parents buy them, and they're not really proven. So studies have shown when you experimentally manipulate it, and let's say you show an app with certain words and pictures, and you say them to a little 2-year-old or 1-year-old, and then you have a live interaction with the identical words, the children only learn from the live interaction. What is one of the reasons for that? Live interactions and book reading is a contingent social experience. There's reciprocity, we're looking at this together, we're sharing interest. A screen is not socially interactive. So if the child looks at one part of the screen, it doesn't go, by the way, that's the ball. But if you're with a parent, the parent says, by the way, that's a ball. So the child's getting contingent labeling exactly at the point in time when they touch and look at the ball. They're going to be more likely to learn that word, for example.
Professor Catherine, thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. I want to ask you one question. Okay, I think it's very important what you said about the books and the stimulate their imagination. But you think nowadays when the children go to the primary school, most of them already know a lot of things, even writes and reads. When they go to the primary school, in my age and other colleagues' age, we only start to learn when you go to primary school. But nowadays, when they go to primary school, they already know everything. And after, what attention they will have in the school if they already know everything? I want to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, so I'm going to just say two things. One, I used book reading to illustrate the importance of material, quality, and so forth. As one illustration, I could come back and do a play talk. Like, I think play follows the same, right? Play is important, so I don't want you to think I only think that. But I have a colleague in Norway, and I gave a talk over in Norway, and she said to me that children start kindergarten at 7 years of age. So they are actually, and I said, what? 7? And she said, yes, they don't believe in teaching children to read at all until after 7, and there's no push for early reading at all. And yet the scores, if you look at the scores in Norway of how children are doing, they are way at the top. They rival China in many ways, but they are doing outstanding. And I don't think this idea of pushing children to know their letters and so forth, will have as much of an effect as kind of interacting in a way the child needs. So I've seen parents with flashcards with learn these letters and trying, my child's 3 and they read. That doesn't mean that that child is going to surpass other kids. I've also seen it with, we do a lot of numeracy work. I was doing here more literacy. Parents are so proud my child can count to 10. So when the child counts to 10, that does not, they don't even know what the number 2 means. If you said, give me 2 cookies, they can't give you 2 cookies. So they have no concept of math, but they're counting. So I think it's the same thing with reading. So to go 1 for you and 1 for me, 1, 2. That live interaction is much more than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? And it's the same with the reading and the literacy. It's this emergent, interactive way. And I do think children will learn later. And there are experiments, such as countries like Norway, where they don't start reading until 7 and then they just take off.